Hello, this is Monica Perez. Thank you for being here. We are continuing our reading of Makers of the Modern Mind by Thomas Neal. And it's good stuff. I have been reading ahead. I hope that doesn't take away from the spontaneity of my reactions. I have to read something 3 times before it sinks in anyway. So some things will continue to surprise me. And here we go. So the chapter we're up to, we're starting Kant. It's chapter 8. And the subtitle is The As If Land. As if. So I actually started making notes. So maybe I'll share some of the notes towards the end. I don't know. I'll leave it on there. Okay. After Newton and Rousseau, the ways of God are justified. Thus spoke Immanuel Kant. Newton, he thought, had penetrated God's design in the universe to discover how all things ran according to immutable law. Rousseau had discovered the dignity of man, whose worth was independent of his social position or the opinion of his fellow men. Newton's work constituted a scientific revolution, Rousseau's a moral and social revolution. Kant summed up his opinion of their work when he observed, quote, Newton saw for the first time order and regularity combined with simplicity, where before him disorder and scattered diversity were discoverable. And since then, the comets move in geometrical paths. I mean, of course, he didn't change it, but it feels like he did because now you see the pattern. You can't unsee a pattern, you know? Rousseau discovered for the first time, under the diversity of the forms assumed by humanity, the deeply hidden nature of man. I'm still not like on board with Rousseau. The deeply hidden nature of man is that he feels. I mean, I feel like man is kind of simple, but I guess that's just one of the diverse forms assumed by me as a member of humanity. So the ways of God were justified, or almost. For Kant was acute enough to see that Newton's world machine disallowed human freedom by making each man merely a nut or a bolt in the vast universal machine. It was also logical. There seemed no escape from Newtonian laws of nature, which were God's laws. Rousseau, on the other hand, had asserted man's freedom and dignity, concepts which put man outside the Newtonian machine and apparently left him a law unto himself. Worse than this apparent contradiction between Newtonian science and Rousseauvian morality was the fact that both stood like naked, defenseless giants before the relentless, sapping attacks of the two current systems of philosophy, German rationalism and English empiricism. Rationalism, gotta lose my New York. Not too much New York. Do I still sound like a New Yorker? I feel like I'm losing it. Rationalism denied. This is how I try to, like, if I'm too New York, I try to think of my mother. He's a rational human being. Yeah, she would never say rational. Anyway, I'm going to say it. Rational denied the validity both of Newton's empirically acquired knowledge and of Rousseau's finding truth in his heart. Hume's empiricism robbed science and morality of all philosophical foundation by asserting that causality is an invention of the mind, that man can objectively assert only that things happen in sequence. Can he even assert that? I thought he was going to come up with, like, time isn't real. I hate that stuff. Please, I hate that stuff. What difference? Even if you can twist your brain to think that's true, it's of anti-value. Kant, therefore, had a complicated problem on his hands. Fundamentally, it was the problem of reconciling the claims of rationalism and empiricism, taking what was good in each system and from them creating a new philosophy which would offer a foundation for Newton's science and Rousseau's morality, both of which Kant felt to be true and therefore demanding of preservation. The Wolffian brand of rationalist philosophy dominated at the same time in the Germanies, stood firm on the fundamental Cartesian position that all true knowledge is at bottom speculative or analytical, that by working up the contents of your mind, you obtain all valid knowledge. It therefore invalidated Newton's position of starting with a blank mind and admitting all the phenomena of nature. And it committed science to go around in useless circles, inasmuch as there could never be anything really new in knowledge. The rationalist experiment in England had gone around the circle to skepticism again. The experiment begun by Descartes to end all uncertainty had ended in Hume's skeptical empiricism, and the empirical philosophers found themselves in the same position in 1770 that the skeptics had occupied in Descartes' boyhood. Hume had simply replaced Montaigne, and Hume's skepticism sapped the philosophical foundations of Newtonian science as thoroughly as did rationalism. For Hume, I'm surprised he didn't give Hume a chapter. For Hume claimed that causality is a product of the mind rather than a certain objective fact. He had made experience, the raw material of any science, a blurred sensation of some sort of something the mind could never comprehend or control. And he had dissolved the mind itself into nothing but a stream of impressions. The scientist was therefore unscientific, according to Hume, when he presumed to talk of causal relationships or of empirically established laws. So Kant's problem was to rescue the new science and the new morality from attacks by either Wolffian rationalism or Humean empiricism. He saw, too, that he must properly limit the philosopher's domain and create, within proper limits, a new philosophy which would be impervious to the attacks of such skeptics as Hume, and which would give philosophical foundation to all the sciences. His work, he therefore, I feel like I read this and I totally did not absorb it because I'm barely absorbing it now. No, it's making sense to me now, but it took me a few. So maybe if you, that's why I try to read it like I'm thinking it, so it's easy to absorb for a listener. All right. Kant's work, he therefore believed would constitute a revolution in philosophy because he proposed to prove that the methods of philosophy thereto used were false, and then to show mankind for all time to come both the proper domain and the correct method of philosophical thinking. That is why he considered himself the Copernicus of philosophy and looked upon his three critiques as the starting place for all future philosophers. I hope he does it. Kant's estimate of himself. Ayn Rand always threw out, I think she used to, like, even in her, did I show you that the three of the books I took with me during the fire? I have first editions. Where are they? They must be even higher up. Yeah, I have her first editions of Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, and it doesn't look like Weed Living is a first edition. And I have two first editions of Tragedy and Hope. But I think in her literature, she would have her characters refer to Kant or Hume. And I believe she always liked Kant. I mean, if I were a hardcore libertarian or Randian, I would probably, I'm sure I would know that. But in any case, just saying that because it sounds like Kant is going to appeal to me. Like I want this. I want him to do this. Although I don't need to reconcile Rousseauvian morality. I get it that he says everything is like feeling, and that is true. And we should try not to hurt each other or ourselves. I don't even know if he said try not to hurt each other. I mean, I need that in my morality. Kant's estimate of himself is historically not far amiss. He is without doubt the most influential of modern philosophers. One author voices the consensus of opinion when he observes, in our time, a thinking person who has not talked things over with Kant cannot claim the title of philosopher. And of the outstanding contemporary Kantian scholars tells us, and one of the outstanding contemporary Kantian scholars tells us, to write an adequate account of the influence of Kant would be to write the history of post Kantian philosophy. In him, as truly as in Descartes, philosophy made a new beginning. It is not only, or perhaps even mainly, in philosophy that Kant has been influential, for it is the gloomy dean of Königsberg more than anyone else who gave the Western world its severe formalistic morality, which has disintegrated only in the past generation. According to Kant, religion becomes a doctrineless affair equated with morality, a horribly forbidding morality that saw sin in every pleasure and virtue in acidosis and biliousness. Hmm. Kant cut Calvinistic virtues away from their assumed theological justification and passed on to mankind an empty duty for duty's sake mentality that made goodness such an old maidish thing in modern times and looked on pleasure as downright devilish. Yeah, uh, he completely lost me. It's the exact opposite thing of what I wanted. I wanted rational thought applied to morality because you can just say if this even if morality wasn't handed down by God, let's say it just bubbled up from the nature of things. Over time, you would find that the moral rules that we abide by, extreme promiscuousness will give you diseases and unmanageable offspring. And on the bigger picture, social relationships provide a kind of insurance. I mean, not being a jerk, you get not jerks around you. You can take care of people, they'll take care of you. Morality to me is highly rational, and this was an opportunity for those two things to be reconciled. And it sounds like he went off the deep end. But of course, what would I expect? Because he's the shaper of the modern mind. Largely because of Kant, lively minds in the past century and a half see better prospects of fun in hell than in heaven. I don't think it works that way. And what kind of fun are you going to have in hell? Have you ever, even if it's bacchanalian, it would be just exhausting. You have to take breaks of that. Whereas, I could definitely hang out with my mom and my parents and the love and the light and the learning and the, all the things that I expect on the bright side. I feel like uh, sounds better. And my thing, there are no assholes in heaven. Like that's what this is all about. So I don't know. All right. The self assured Little East Prussian is important then, both in the history of philosophy and in the making of the modern mind. His influence, of course, has not been as direct as that of Rousseau or Marx or Darwin, because none but philosophers and Protestant theologians presume to read him. His influence on the modern mind is indirect, but it is nonetheless real and potent, because Protestant teachers and preachers, or their teachers, read Kant and were influenced by him. Their whole movement of philosophy and of religion throughout the 19th and 20th centuries has taken its direction from Kant, and his influence has therefore seeped down from the universities and pulpits of Europe and America to the multitudes. So the vast masses have been affected by the thoughts that fermented for long years in the head of the sage of Königsberg and finally found their way into print in the decade of the 1780s. Kant is particularly important because of the central position he occupies in the history of human thought. Like Descartes, he found philosophy a disintegrating corpse. Through an overdose of skepticism, it had committed a logical suicide in England, while in Germany, it simply failed to square with the undeniable facts of life. Either it had to be buried or it had to be given new life. And Kant gave the old corpse of philosophy new life. He preserved what he wanted of both decadent rationalism and the new empiricism. And he organized this debris into his new critical system, which in turn became the springboard for 19th century philosophers. In the same way, when faith and religious doctrines were weakening, Kant rescued morality from theology and passed on to subsequent generations Calvin's forbidding precepts without their logical basis in a severe God's arbitrary will. Thus, Kant acts historically like the waistline of an hourglass. Everything salvaged from this 18th century philosophy and religion passes through him. Whatever the 19th century possesses in this regard, it gets from him. Perhaps one can be a good philosopher without knowing Kant, but one cannot understand how the modern mind came to be what it is without knowing this engineer of philosophy's last great revolution, from which stem all subsequent little philosophical uprisings. And that was just the intro. We're on section 1. And I have to say something that's emerged in this book that's annoying me. Someone prior to me underlined it. And not very neatly. I hate that. I don't even really like annotating for myself, but sometimes I just have to for future reference. I just have to, but try to do it in pencil at least. All right. And sometimes if I'm really being neurotic, I'll buy, if it's a cheap book or whatever, I'll buy 2 copies of it. I'll keep one nice and I'll write in the other one, please. I haven't done that in a while. I can't be bothered with that anymore. All right. It is a difficult matter, says the German romanticist Heinrich Heine, to write the life history of Immanuel Kant, for he had neither life nor history. He lived a mechanically ordered, abstract, old bachelor kind of existence in a quiet, retired alley in Königsberg, an old town in the northeast corner of Germany. If we grant Heine the license with which poets, especially of the Romantic school, handle historical facts, we can agree to the truth in his statement, but it does not draw an accurate picture of Kant. True, Kant's life was undramatic. He was born in Königsberg in 1724 when Newton was at the height of his fame and Rousseau was still an unknown apprentice in Geneva. And he died in the same city in 1804, the year in which Napoleon was crowned emperor. In those 80 years when scholars normally traveled extensively, he never set foot outside East Prussia. And though for many years he regularly drove into the country for recreation, in later life he denied himself even this break in his rigorous schedule of duty-imposed labor. Like Descartes, Newton, and Locke, he lived out his days a bachelor. He is reported to have considered proposing twice, but each time he was so long mooting the step and calculating his finances that when he came to a decision, he found the object of his choice had already married. No wonder Heine thought he had neither life nor history. Kant came from self-consciously respectable middle-class people. His father was a saddler by trade, a severely moral rather than a really religious man. His mother is remembered as a deeply religious woman whom Kant describes thus. My mother was a sweet-tempered, affectionate, pious, and upright woman and a tender mother who led her children to the fear of God by pious teaching and virtuous example. Very nice. Both Kant's parents, in fact, were warm adherents of the pietistic movement then so strong in the Germanies. From them, young Immanuel seems to have received a strong sense of independence, a respect for education, and a schooling in pietism, which was one strong current of the 18th century German Aufklärung, or Enlightenment. Of this religious movement, Kant said in old age, people may say of pietism what they will. Those in whom it was sincere were worthy of honor. They possessed the highest thing that man can have, the quiet, the content, the inner peace which no suffering can disturb. No need, no persecution could disturb them. No quarreler could move them to anger or hate. In 1732, Immanuel entered the Collegium Fredericianum. I mean, obviously it's about Frederick, but I don't know how you pronounce the C followed by an I in German. Where for 8 years he received a solid training in Latin and a thorough soaking in pietistic principles. Here he was appalled by the insincerity of most of the students, who were compelled frequently to utter highly emotional prayers and always to wear the forbidding countenance of a good pietist, while scheming and pranking as normal boys have always done. In 1740, Kant matriculated at the University of Königsberg, where he received whatever formal education he obtained, and where he met the second strong influence of the Aufklärung, rationalism. For although the university was hardly an institution of higher learning in those days, it seems that in it Kant became acquainted with the Wolffian brand of rationalism then popular in the German universities and with Newtonian science. His most capable teacher, Martin Knudsen, must have considered him an unusual student, for he gave him free run of his private library and encouraged him to work in the popular field of the natural sciences. Very little is known of Kant's student days, but we can surmise that he was an able student and that he was strongly enough attracted to university life to make teaching his career. For some years after graduation, Kant served as a tutor in various East Prussian households, then a menial position which he apparently filled with only mediocre success. He tells us of his tutorial work that no one said, wow, it was a menial position. Like Alexander was tutored by Aristotle. I always thought it was the coolest thing to be a tutor. He tells us of his tutorial work that no one's theory was better than his and no one's practice was worse. Ah, I see. In 1755, Kant returned to the University of Königsberg as a private lecturer. He was allowed to give courses at the university, but he was paid no salary except what he collected in fees from the students. For 15 years, he held this position, during which time he gained reputation as an excellent lecturer, not only among the students, but also with the general public. In these years, he lectured on such diverse subjects as logic and geography, mineralogy and mathematics, natural law and pedagogics. Twice, when there were vacancies on the staff, Kant applied for a professorship. But the only official position he obtained before 1770 was that of assistant librarian. In 1770, however, when he was 46, he was given the professorship in logic and metaphysics, a position he held for the rest of his life. From this time on, Kant's life moved, as Heine described it, like a clock. Daily he rose at 5, studied till either 7 or 8 in the morning, depending on whether it was the summer or winter semester. I bet it had to do with when the sun rose. Lectured for 2 hours and then studied the rest of the morning. He dined at 1, prolonged the meal 2 or 3 hours with conversation, walked for an hour, and then spent the rest of the day in reading and meditation till 10 in the evening, when he retired. For over a decade, Kant wrestled with the new philosophy that was taking shape in his head. At length, in 1781, fearful that he might die before he could put his revolutionary ideas on paper, he hurriedly wrote his Critique of Pure Reason. 10 amazing years of production followed, during which time Kant published his Critique of Practical Reason, his Critique of Judgment, and such less important works as Prolegomena to any future metaphysic, fundamental principles of the metaphysic of morals, and metaphysical first principles of natural science. Thus, Kant published all the works on which his fame and importance rest after his 55th birthday, at which age Descartes was a year in his grave. Interesting. So he did more as an older guy than he did as a younger guy. I don't think the comparison with Descartes is weird. Through the last decade of the 18th century, Kant steadily declined in health and in mental vigor. In 1795, he restricted himself to his daily public lecture, and 2 years later, after 42 years of lecturing at the University of Königsberg, he retired from the platform altogether. His health grew progressively worse in the last 5 years of his life, a fact which he characteristically blamed on the excessive amount of electricity in the air. He might not be wrong. His mental activity was so impaired in these last years that his younger associates had to care for him like a child. You think electricity causes Alzheimer's? I mean, obviously you have to be sensitive to it for it to get you, but that's not, as a celiac or probable celiac, I can tell you, you can be sensitive to stuff other people can handle. Finally, in 1804, shortly before he finished his 80th year, he died within a few blocks of his birthplace. Fittingly, He was buried in the professor's vault of the university to which he had given the repute of his name. Section 2. Kant was a typical professor, an ideal figure to caricature, and Heine, as we have seen, drew a caricature of the Prussian philosopher that has passed for an accurate portrait this past century. Quote, getting up, he tells us of Kant, drinking coffee, lecturing, eating, going for a walk, everything had its fixed time, and the neighbors knew that it must be exactly half past 4 when Immanuel Kant, in his gray frock coat with his Spanish cane in hand, stepped from his door and walked towards the little lime tree Ave, which is called after him the Philosopher's Walk. Interesting. Such a picture, again, is misleading. Kant came to live with clock-like regularity only through long, tedious discipline. Yes, it is tedious. I can't do it. He trained himself to. He's not the only one, though, right? Who did this? Wasn't there another one who was like super, super disciplined with his schedule? Maybe most of them, if truth be told. He trained himself to regularity of physical and mental living so as to make the most efficient use of the hours measured out to him. Even his style of writing seems to have been so pruned, for whereas his earlier works show some degree of literary skill and facility of expression, his later writings are studiedly arid and repellingly technical. I think, didn't Newton do that too? Repellingly technical on purpose. Kant, like Newton, schooled himself to write so that the phrase never dressed up the idea. Like Newton, too, he apparently wanted to repel all but really serious readers. Originally, he was quite a social light in Königsberg. He played billiards and cards, at both of which he excelled, and at both of which he regularly won money. He was a lively conversationalist, a celebrated storyteller, a popular guest at any social gathering in Königsberg. He clearly had social talents of a high order, even for the cosmopolitan 18th century. His friends in Königsberg were many, from members of the nobility to officers of both the Prussian and Russian armies. But his closest associates came from the merchant classes of the city, men whose thinking was more progressive and apparently more congenial to Kant, men whose regularity of life he approved, whose knowledge of foreign lands he wished to acquire. You'd have thought he was talking about the military guys, foreign lands, regularity of life, but I guess the German merchant has those qualities as well. He was, in his early days, anything but the dry, turgid lecturer that a typical professor is supposed to be. He was popular as a teacher, both with the students and with the public who were admitted to many of the university professors' lectures. He lectured to officers of the Prussian garrison stationed in Königsberg, and even to Russian officers occupying the city during the 7 Years' War. Herder, who attended his classes in the 60s, speaks of the joyous courage Kant exhibited on the platform and of the cheerfulness and joy which he infused into his work. He had at his service, Herder goes on, jest, witticism, and humorous fancy, and his lectures were at once instructive and most entertaining. With the same spirit in which he criticized Leibniz, Wolff, Baumgarten, Crucius, and Hume, he investigated the natural laws of Newton, Kepler, and the physicists. Kant was not content to be entertaining and witty and popular. He had a great mission in life, to be the Copernicus of philosophy, and he must dedicate his every moment to fulfilling that mission. He came then rigorously to regulate every act of his life by principles he laid down for himself. Everything was brought under a severe regimen, physically, morally, economically, even dietetically. The late Ernst Cassirer, an outstanding Kantian scholar, tells us that in Kant, rule and method constituted the animating and inspiring principles. Order and law, coherence and consistency are the guiding stars of Kant's being. All this self-discipline was for what he deemed to be his duty. Kant's life, indeed, was one long ode to duty. Like most bachelors, Kant was much concerned with the health of a never robust body, which nevertheless he managed to keep in action for almost 80 years. Wisely, he refused to have anything to do with 18th century doctors. He devised instead his own set of rules for keeping fit. To these, he adhered rigidly. About them, he was always glad to discourse when he could find a listener. His daily life became, from outward appearances, absolutely mechanical. Everything was done according to the clock throughout his later life, from the time he was called at 4:55 in the morning until he retired at 10 in the evening. And his thinking was as systematic, as regular as his daily routine. Kant is one of history's most methodical thinkers, a man who rejoiced in definitions, distinctions, and deductions, whose treatises often seem more the work of a lawyer than a philosopher. But for all this emphasis on order and system, Kant did not delimit his horizon to the narrow alley of later German Wissenschaft. He read everything he could lay his hands on, especially travel literature, works on natural sciences, and newspapers. Then a novelty. Hmm. Might we be better off without newspapers? He was the walking library of Königsberg, a fund of information to all citizens of the town. When the earthquake of 1755 rocked Lisbon, causing consternation all over Europe, it was Kant who explained the phenomenon to his fellow townsmen. Although he had never set foot outside East Prussia and had never seen a mountain or probably even the sea, Kant's wide reading enabled him to teach physical geography at the university, the first academic teacher of this subject. An English visitor who heard him describe Westminster Bridge could not be made to believe that Kant had not seen it with his own eyes. Kant was a thoroughly respectable middle-class Prussian then, who strictly regulated the social side of his nature to devote himself exclusively to his double mission of teaching at the University of Königsberg and of founding his new philosophy. His life was directed by principle, and so far as we know, he never wandered from the path of duty as he saw it. Respectable as Kant was, he does not seem to have elicited love or admiration. Like many teachers, he grew to be a bad listener. I must give myself up to the movement of my own thoughts, he tells us, which for some years have followed a kind of beaten track. So he came to have patience for little but his own thoughts and his own voice. In the days of his fame, he was annoyingly dogmatic, although he never completely cut himself off from the thinking of other men, as tradition has it, nor did he remain completely unmoved by criticism of his views. Nevertheless, he tended to look upon those who differed with him in later life as false friends and bad philosophers. I mean, it's like religion. If you think you're right, you think the other guy is wrong. I mean, a lot of people disagree with you, but what are you supposed to think? The little Prussian philosopher of Königsberg has often been likened to Socrates. Did he not write anything down? Kant was not the man, however, to drink hemlock for his principles. His was not a strong, forceful nature. For although he was resolute in following his thoughts to their logical conclusions, he was not forthright in stating them publicly. While he never said what he knew was untrue, he sometimes avoided stating the truth. He admitted that, quote, I think many things with the clearest conviction and to my great satisfaction, which I never have the courage to say. But I will never say anything which I do not think. I can understand that. I felt a little bit like that on the radio. I had two rules. I wouldn't say anything I didn't think was true, and I wouldn't be rude to callers, which are probably two. I was probably the only one who did both of those. He submitted without struggle in the one instance when his writings offended the government because he thought it was his duty to do so. In 1794, the Prussian cabinet issued a cease and desist order when it thought that the new critical principles in Kant's religion within the bounds of pure reason undermined the foundations of religion. Kant believed the government wrong, but he was not made of martyrs or of hero stuff. Moreover, he had by this time convinced himself of the absolute duty of obedience that he, as a subject, owed to his sovereign. So he submitted to the order and consoled himself by reflecting, recantation and denial of one's inner convictions is base, but silence in a case like the present is a subject's duty. And if all that one says must be true, It does not follow that it is one's duty to tell publicly everything which is true. When the pious Frederick William II died 3 years later, Kant considered himself to be absolved from the prohibition, so he prepared a second edition of the work. I'm going to talk to, I think, Scott and or William about this book. And I want to ask them what they think about this, because ask yourself, if this guy's undermining religion in Germany, Prussia, and the Kaiser wanted him to stop, and after the Kaiser died or whatever, Frederick William II. Oh, maybe it wasn't a Kaiser. Maybe it was just a king. 1794 in Prussia. Anyway, whatever. Was the place better off after Kant than influence people to his point of view? I mean, that's the thing with church and state. You don't have to forbid other religions. You don't have to persecute people. But if you want your government to be run according to a coherent body of principles, and that's the religion, I mean, I think you have to have a coherent body of principles to run a nation. And I think we had this amazing experiment in the Constitution. It's being undermined right now, but I want to understand better the concept of the confessional state. Is that just when it's a Catholic country? I don't know, but it's not necessarily about persecution. It's not about welfare. It's not about tithing. It's sometimes just about what informs the moral laws. And to think that we don't have legislated moral laws, think about the battle that rages about abortion and adoption and stuff that's moral and like non-science based recycling, or like rules that are really based on a kind of environmental religion. They're not in the books because of science. They don't have to prove that it's the right thing to do. Think of COVID policy. Those masks and everything, that was religious, So don't you want a coherent, like universally accepted? I don't know. That's the question I want to ask. Kantian students divide their master's life, this is section 3, into 2 periods. The pre-critical till 1770, and the period after 1770 when his thought reached maturity. Except for the light they threw upon his mental development, his earlier writings are of no account. Through the 1750s, he wrote on such scientific subjects as earthquakes, the theory of the heavens, and whether the west wind in Europe is moist because it has crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Sounds like an easy one. In the next decade, he turned toward metaphysical and ethical problems. Through both these decades, Kant groped for principles by which he could explain science and morality and philosophically establish their claims to be accounted branches of valid knowledge. By 1770, when he received his appointment as professor at the University of Königsberg, he had arrived at the threshold of his critical system. The road had been long and hard for Kant because he had seen the difficulties besetting philosophy in the 18th century, and he had not sidestepped them. He had seen the claims both of rationalism and empiricism. He had seen the conflict between rationalism and Rousseau's sentimental morality, between Newtonian science and Hume's indifferentism. These were conflicts which Kant had to show to be apparent rather than real, or else it would be necessary for him to give up either the new science or the new morality. Yeah, I'd be tossing Rousseau, bro. Okay. Although he had been teaching the Wolffian brand of rationalism for 2 decades, Kant was both open-minded enough and acute enough to see its inadequacy. He saw how it made knowledge essentially a closed system, with philosophers condemned to nothing but analysis and deduction, more deduction and more analysis. By its denial of empirically acquired knowledge, Kant saw rationalism sentenced itself to a smothering death. Hume's criticisms awoke him, he tells us, from his dogmatic slumbers, for he saw that rationalists had no answers to the difficulties raised by the Scotch skeptic. He saw truth, moreover, in Hume's claim that knowledge is acquired empirically, that it is a a posteriori rather than a priori. Okay, so he saw truth moreover in Hume's claim that knowledge is acquired empirically, that it is a posteriori rather than a priori. That was one of Hume's thing? Because knowledge, I agree, knowledge is empirical. Who said there was no such thing as causation? This guy, right? Whatever. But at the same time, Kant did not like Hume's skepticism because it denied the validity not only of philosophy, but also of science. Nor did he think Hume right in getting rid of the mind altogether by reducing it. Oh, it was Hume who said that there's no causality to a succession of experiences. Kant felt, therefore, that he must make a new start. The philosophy of the rationalists, he decided, had become a dark ocean without shores or lighthouses. There reign in philosophy, he wrote in the preface of the Critique of Pure Reason, weariness and complete indifferentism, the mother of chaos and night in all science. Skepticism is one answer to such a state of affairs, but it did not satisfy Kant. He was not one to surrender without a battle, as skeptics do. He therefore decided to take stock of man's intellectual accomplishments, to rescue what was valid from rationalism and to reconcile it with what he could find valid in English empiricism. For Kant was realistic enough to see that knowledge is neither independent of experience, as the rationalists held, nor a mere succession of experiences, as the empiricists held. Neither was completely right to the exclusion of the other, because both were partly right. From all these elements, he would therefore build a system which would stand proof against the new skepticism, as Descartes had decided to do a century and a half earlier. Where Descartes had adopted the deductive reasoning of the mathematician for his new philosophical system, however, Kant turned to the physicist's empirical approach as the surest and safest method of building a body of knowledge. In this way, Kant hoped to construct an unassailable body of principles. His new philosophy, like the new science, would be cautious in accepting only empirically verifiable truths. It would, in short, be the critical philosophy. And through the sieve of his critical method, Kant was sure he would sift only the sands of truth. All else would be rejected. I wonder if this is the root of critical theory. Could it be? That would be yucky. I think that would be quite bad. Oh my goodness. It was natural for Kant, in taking stock of man's intellectual accomplishments, to contrast Wolffian rationalism with Newtonian science. Philosophy was in no better condition than it had been 2 centuries before. It was worse, in fact, for while philosophers bickered and got nowhere, philosophy had fallen into deserved discredit. Science, on the other hand, had progressed steadily, as Bacon and Descartes had observed long before. It accepted as true only what could be demonstrated and proved by controlled experiment. Therefore, it was respected both for its progress and for its modesty, since it made no extravagant claims. Moreover, it not only found new truths, but on the basis of what it had established empirically, it predicted additional discoveries. As its hypotheses became theories and its theories laws, science enlarged the domain of human knowledge steadily and surely until it promised by this method to stretch out the horizons of man's mind to unimaginable limits. Kant therefore asked himself how science differed from philosophy. He found in the first place that it subjected itself to self-criticism, where philosophy did not. Our age is, in every sense of the word, he concluded, the age of criticism, and everything must submit to it. His Copernican revolution in philosophy must therefore make this subject self-critical. In the next place, Kant decided philosophy must change methods. Since Descartes' time, rationalists had relied on the mathematical method of deductive reasoning. But this method, valid for a subject which begins with definitions and proceeds to build an edifice constructed a priori by the mind, is not valid for philosophy. There, Kant held, we have to do with a reality which we do not construct. We cannot begin with definitions. We must begin with experience. We shall therefore profit most if we study the method of physics. Kant will proceed with philosophy then, as Newton had proceeded with physics. The true method of metaphysics is fundamentally the same as that which Newton has introduced into natural science and which has there yielded such fruitful results. He therefore commits himself to a denial of all knowledge that transcends experience. All valid knowledge is a posteriori. To this extent, his reaction to rationalism was much the same as Locke's. Kant insists on the empirical element in all knowledge. Nothing which does not enter through the senses or is implicit in sense knowledge is to be accredited as authentic. But at this point, as we shall see later, Kant breaks with Locke, for he insists that all sense knowledge has a priori as well as empirical elements in it, that knowledge must, by its very nature, be affected by the knowing subject. But Kantian philosophy is more than Newtonian science applied to metaphysics. There was something else which Kant wanted to salvage from the 18th century, and this was the Rousseauian concept of man's worth and dignity and freedom. Okay. There is no doubt that Kant, who was the opposite of Rousseau in almost every way, was nevertheless strongly impressed by the unruly Genevan. Kant was one of the first Germans to see good in Rousseau's passionate essays. He was undoubtedly the first to appreciate their fundamental importance. It is, however, not so much specific points of Rousseauian doctrine as the latter's general attitude that Kant incorporated into his own work. Herder tells us how, in his lectures in the 1760s, Kant took up the writings of Rousseau, then just appearing, his Emile and his Heloise, appraised them, and returned again and again to an unaffected insight into the nature and the moral worth of man. But didn't Rousseau's contribution come after that? Weren't Emile and Heloise not the things that shaped the modern mind? I feel like I remember that. Kant frequently mentions his debt to Rousseau. I am myself by inclination a seeker after truth. He summed it up. I feel a consuming thirst for knowledge and a restless passion to advance in it, as well as satisfaction in every forward step. There was a time when I thought that this alone could constitute the honor of mankind, and I despised the common man who knows nothing. Rousseau set me right. This blind prejudice vanished. I learned to respect human nature. Like see Christ in everyone? Sorry. I feel like they're reinventing the wheel here and not better. Kant appreciated Rousseau for his fearlessness, for the independence of his thought and feeling, for his insistence on the primacy of morality over dogma, of action over theory. And he prized him for extolling man as man. Thus, Kant began to construct his new critical philosophy out of two elements, Newtonian science and Rousseauian morality. His new philosophy had to reconcile these elements and at the same time keep from future conflicts by confining them to distinct realms of thought. Well could the epitaph Kant wrote for his own tombstone be placed on the title page of his collected works. The starry heavens above me, the moral law within me. It is therefore not surprising to find that as Descartes' philosophy became a kind of mathematicism, so Kant's was a combined physicism and moralism. I think this is a short or a long chapter. Hold on, bubbies. That would be 12. Yeah, it's a super short chapter, so I think I'm gonna leave it there and finish it next time as we begin section 4. And I have stuff going on in my house. Someone told me they're not sick of hearing about fire stuff. Well, an insurance person just showed up at my house and for hours. It's just like taking samples everywhere. But I don't know what she's going to use it for. So I don't know if it's like a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know if my insurance is going to get canceled or I'm going to get a bunch of money. So I probably better go check on that. It's really not cool. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. And I will see you next time for part 2 of the Kant chapter from Makers of the Modern Mind.